What about what about it? Okay, so let's now start with let's start this interview with the title of your book, Greedy Bastards. Now, in the introduction, you take pains to say who it's not referring to, which would be kind of rank and file police officers and firefighters. So let's specify who exactly are you referring to with the title?
Well, yeah, in the intro to the book, I give credit to the president of the Police Officers Association, the union president, for coining the phrase. It's borrowed from him in one of the videos of him talking about me, and when and that was back in 2014 when they first were doing their interviews, and you're familiar with the Ron DeLorde book, Union, Power, Politics, and Conflict in the 21st Century, and one of their mantras is escalation is key. And so they were trying to portray me as well as my team, who were working on changing the old business model of those 1988 contracts, as anti-police, which isn't the case, because you covered City Hall. I recommended and the council approved adding nearly 700 new police and fire personnel. It's a core business of the city and an important part. But he said that we were portraying them as greedy bastards and that they weren't greedy bastards. And I joked at the time when I saw the commercial or the video of his interview and said, gosh, if I ever write a book, he just gave me the title to the book. And we joked about that over the years. And so I decided I'd go ahead and use it. Yeah.
It is funny. Somebody sent me a screenshot of it. I think it was the first day the public became aware that this was going to be on sale through Amazon, and I thought it was a joke. Honestly, I didn't think you would. I didn't think you would write a book with the title "Greedy Bastards." But there you go. What do I know?
But the subtitle, I think, explains it. It was a hardball experience, and I think the title reflects that. Changing those 25-year-old contracts that had been in place for all that time and had never been changed but just added to was a difficult undertaking. No one before me had tried to do that, but I saw our financial future, which was leading to a bankruptcy of the city if they weren't changed. Not during my tenure. I could have left it for Eric or whoever the next city manager would have been. But we saw it, and rather than wait for a crisis or an emergency, it was time to deal with it. So
now, given that so you got the title "Greedy Bastards," and the very last word in your book is checkmate. There does seem to be a degree of score settling with this book. How much of that was a motivation in writing it?
It really wasn't, because I started writing this book before we had a conclusion on the fire union arbitration. As I said in the epilogue, which I didn't write until after the arbitration decision came down on February 14th of this year, I thought one of two things would happen after they were able to get the voters to approve binding arbitration in November of 2018. Either they would get their candidate elected mayor in hopes that he would influence enough council members to support what they wanted, or if he didn't get elected, they'd go to binding arbitration. And that's exactly what happened. They tried. Both unions actually worked to try to get their candidate, Greg Brockhouse, elected mayor. And when he lost the following week, the fire union declared impasse and requested binding arbitration.
Now, the first half of your book is largely dedicated to your experience in the first few years on arriving in San Antonio. So you were hired in 2005. Describe what kind of organization you found when you got here.
Well, it needed a lot of improvement, as I discuss in the book.
Like I said, it was the first half of the book. So yeah, there seemed to be there seemed to be a lot to write about at least. So what
Well,
were the problems?
yeah, well, first of all, about 1/3 of the executive positions were vacant.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of hiring that needed to be done, and the mayor and city council wanted me to assess talent and make changes. I say in the book, it was Richard Pettis was on the city council at the time and said, fire everybody and start over.
Wow.
Uh, which I said, wow, okay, that tells me there's a lot of work to be done.
Mhm.
By the way, I did replace about the 40 department heads, all but one.
Mhm.
Ramiro Salazar, our library director, we fondly refer to as last man standing. Um,
What is that?
and well, he's the only department head I
Oh,
didn't
okay,
replace.
got it.
And I did replace, of course, all the overtime, all the deputy and assistant managers as well.
Mhm.
Some left on their own, others left because they needed to leave. But uh, in any event, that was primary. Secondly, the financial house was not in order. I was city manager for 9 months before I could get a financial report from the finance department, and I almost quit over that. At the time, the city was a more than $2 billion operation, and you can't run a business if you don't know where you
Uh,
stand financially.
well, and how serious are you that you almost quit at that point? Because I mean, that was a really remarkable part of the book. I mean, you couldn't get any kind of financial reporting that, you know, the city's finance department just wasn't set up to provide it. But that's interesting. Like how serious a claim is that
It
you
was
thought about?
very, it was very serious. I tell
Uh,
the story of the consultant that we had hired to evaluate the changes that were needed. I had I
mhm.
removed the finance director who was there at the time, and uh, uh, talked Ben Gorzel into assuming the role
Mhm.
initially on an interim basis, and then appointed him finance director, and later
Mhm.
upgraded that position to chief financial officer for the city. I feel strongly in any aspect of the organization, whether I'm working on an economic development project or a major
Mhm.
initiative for the city, to me, it's important that the chief financial officer be a part of the team to keep us
Mhm.
well informed as to the financial implications of what we're doing. But I tell the story of Phil calling me over the Christmas holiday when I had gone back to Phoenix to be with my husband and son, who was a senior in high school, and my daughter came home to Phoenix. She was already a sophomore at the University of Texas.
Mhm.
Um, for Christmas, and Phil called a couple of times and said, "You're coming back, aren't you?" And I said, "Gosh, Phil, you didn't tell me how bad it is." And he said, "We didn't know. That's why we recruited you."
Mhm.
And this consultant that we had hired to take a look at the finance department to give me
Mhm.
an analysis of the talent base there
Mhm.
as part of our review of what the problems were, called me over the Christmas holiday and said, "Can you come back early? I really need to talk with you just one-on-one and download what I have found so far." So I flew in, I moved my flight back to New Year's Day, and met with him to talk about the problems. And we basically reorganized the entire department. Everybody moved out of positions. They had to reapply. Many people did
Mhm.
not get back into the department because they didn't have the proper skill set. We had fewer people, but at higher skill levels, and were able to get the department in order, and it took time. But
Mhm.
the reason I didn't leave was that that was pre-Great Recession.
Mhm.
The economy was still very strong in '06, '07, and uh, at least in '06 it was. So I knew the money was coming in. I just didn't know how much.
Right. Uh-huh.
And I actually presented the budget without having an audited statement from the previous fiscal year. It was after the budget adoption that I actually
Mhm.
got an audit for the previous year. But we did turn that around in less than 2 years. And you know the story about SAP. They had tried to,
Mhm.
they had hired or bought a new financial system, but didn't have an implementation plan in place.
Yeah.
So
I love the little nugget in your book about how some city departments could opt out if they wanted to, out of using SAP rather than having it be like organization-wide. I love that. That
oh
was
my
great.
gosh, who allows that to happen?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we got all that straightened around. No books by hand, no separate set of books. Trained people to be able to use the system. And fortunately, I had been a part of and had overseen the transition to SAP when I was in Phoenix. That went off without a hitch, and I give all the credit to outstanding financial staff in Phoenix, but they were on top of it every single day. It was seamless.
Yeah.
I inherited a lawsuit associated with that project, but because I had worked on SAP previously, it gave me that experience to know what a good implementation plan looked like.
Now, to go back to your time in Phoenix, I mean, Phoenix is generally regarded as a pretty well managed city. You got a cold call from a headhunter asking you to apply for the city manager's position in San Antonio. And they told you up front that they would pay you $300,000. That rarely happens. You get a dollar amount in your first call from a headhunter. But that must have given you some clue that there were some problems in San Antonio.
Oh, it did.
You referred to that in the book. I guess my question is, what was your motivation in coming here? Was it, would you have come here were it not for the $300,000 offer, which at the time made you one of the highest, or would have made you one of the highest paid city managers in the country? Like, was that what got you interested?
No, actually, I was intrigued for a couple of reasons. One, Phoenix is the largest council manager plan city in the country. I had been there for 16 years. I was the number 2 person there. I had been, of course, city manager of Kalamazoo, Michigan, was recruited to Phoenix, first female deputy city manager in Phoenix, which was kind of shocking to me in 1988 to be the first female there. But worked there and had unbelievable experience. And I wanted to be the city manager there. My manager kept saying he was going to retire, and he never retired. And I wanted to be a city manager again, number 1. San Antonio was the 2nd largest council manager plan city in the country. Dallas is number 3. So being a city manager again. And then thirdly, my daughter was a sophomore at the University of Texas. So when she graduated from high school in Phoenix, she chose to come to the University of Texas. She was a pre-dental student, and the dentist that she had interned with when she was in high school, pediatric dentist, had graduated from Baylor Dental School and recommended to her that she take a look at the schools in Texas. So she was in Texas, and my son was recruited across the country for soccer. And we knew he wasn't staying in Arizona for college. He would be going off, and he decided to go to Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California. He wanted to play Division I soccer, and they wanted him. So we didn't have to stay in Phoenix, and I wanted to be a manager again. And I thought, well, I'll give it 2 years. I signed a 2-year agreement. Actually, the way the headhunter, they approached me, I tell the story in the book. I gave my usual spiel. I love Phoenix. I want to be the manager here. I have great opportunity. I'm staying. And that's at the end when she said, they really want to talk to you, and they'll pay you $300,000 to come here. And I hesitated. And I said, why? What's going on? So she said they're looking for a seasoned manager that's had experience with change management because they want a tremendous amount of improvement. So I was intrigued. I talked with my manager at the time, the city manager, and said, I haven't interviewed in 16 years. I've been here in Phoenix. You've given me a great opportunity, but I think I should take a look at it. He encouraged me. He said, well, I don't want you to leave, but take a look at it. I mean, he said, I'm not going anywhere right away, but if you want to do that. And I thought, well, I could always come back to Phoenix if that didn't work out in San Antonio. But here I am 15 years later.
Right. Let me, let's look at a very specific moment in your early time in San Antonio that you refer to in the book. So you're a fan of the management guru, Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. And you seem to be, a student of his. And, I'm going to mention this small dinner you had with him in 2006. It was the International City Managers Association had their convention in San Antonio. You had a chance to meet with him over dinner with other city managers. And I'll read you the quote. Collins talked about his good to great formula as it applied to cities in that conversation, and I didn't hold back. Quote, heck, I'm just trying to get from shitty to good right now. So, all right, so tell us exactly what you meant by that, contextualize.
What, tell me what?
Exactly what you meant by that quote. I would love to say it again, but it's a PG-13 interview. So
okay. You cut out there for a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't tell my staff about it at the time, nor anyone else. And it was, it was a private dinner. There were just a few managers, and I wasn't the only one who said that at that dinner also. But it was, and maybe it's because I had worked in the two previous cities were well-regarded council manager cities with excellent bond ratings and excellent reputations. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Phoenix when I was recruited there was because it was considered one of, if not the best managed city council manager city in the country, had great city managers. And I wanted an association with greatness. I wanted to learn from those who had done it very well and have a big city experience managing. So I was willing to go from a city manager to a deputy manager there because I knew I'd still have a tremendous amount of experience and be offered many different kinds of things to do in a city that was eight times bigger than the city I was managing. And coming to San Antonio, it didn't have that same kind of reputation. It had a great reputation as a tourism destination and, for hosting conferences and meetings, and a wonderful place to visit in the downtown Riverwalk and of course the Alamo. But it wasn't as well regarded, and I viewed it as a challenge. That is, here's an opportunity to help make a community better. It wasn't just me. I mean, I had to assemble a team. We did this. The things we accomplished, we did together. And under the leadership of 47 different elected officials that I worked with over the 14 years, including 4 different mayors. That kind of turnover is a challenge, but it was about making the community better. And because I had experience in 2 previous cities undertaking the kinds of things that this city council in San Antonio was looking for, I thought I could make a difference. So I signed that initial 2-year agreement, and then my contract, as you know, was extended 5 times by the mayor and councils. And we continued to make improvements for the community. And I say in the book that I think some of that was overshadowed by the negativity imposed on all of us, primarily me, but all of us, with regard to how we had improved San Antonio city government and the community. I mean, to think that we did $2 billion in bond programs during that time frame, as opposed to the 15 years before me that accomplished not even 350 million. There were just so many things that we were able to work on and make improvements that it was about, it wasn't so great when I came I mean, there was, the police chief was retiring, the fire chief was retiring, there was no aviation director, development services was a mess. It was called the last stop, the final stop.
And you had inspectors on the take. You actually
inspectors
had inspectors
on the take. So there was, I think that describes shitty to good. And so we had to, set some baseline accountability in place and then build from there. And I think we did that, but it's a work in progress. You've never arrived. There are always areas where we can still improve. I drove over a couple of streets today that I made a note that I'm going to send after we're off this call, a note to the public works staff to say, hey, the detour on Broadway is down North Alamo and it is a third world street. We've got to get that paved. So
yeah, by the way, there are a couple of spots in the book where I think you inadvertently slip into present tense when you were talking about work as the city manager. So you must still be in that headspace a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. But even when I travel to other cities, I look at the city from a city manager's perspective. What's the condition of their infrastructure? Do you feel safe when you're walking the streets in the evening? Is garbage collected, or is there trash strewn along the streetways? Are the parks are the parks beautiful and enjoyable, and are families using them? So I look at every city as a city manager, and because I worked here as city manager for 14 years and I still live here, I feel that connection, and I talk with the staff regularly.
Now, at several points in the book, and you mentioned it just a couple of minutes ago, you note that given the structure of our city council, you face a lot of new council members every 2 years for a total of 47. I've heard that a lot. It seems to, I think when you were leaving, you noted that in a lot of interviews. This is when you were retiring. And like I said, it's in several places in your book. How problematic was it? And was there anything you felt like you'd wanted to accomplish that you couldn't because you were constantly dealing with relatively inexperienced council members?
Well, let me say this, that in the previous cities where I was there, in Kalamazoo for 14 years and in Phoenix 16 years, with half as many council members over that same time frame, when you have longer tenure, and in Phoenix, the term limit was 8 years, but they had 2 4-year terms. So they weren't always running. They weren't always campaigning. So the way our system works, new people come in, they get acclimated, it takes several months. You get about a year of productive real work, and then they're running again. And so you covered City Hall, what it's like when people are running. They're more cautious. They aren't thinking long-term necessarily. They're thinking short-term. What did I accomplish in my short term on city council for these constituents in my district? So it just makes it a bigger challenge. And the biggest challenge is thinking big picture for the city as well as long-term. Strategically, what do we need to do to really make the community better? And it doesn't happen in just 2 years, but our reward system here, the political reward system, is how much can I get for my residents in this 2-year period of time that I'm serving them? And each council member wants to deliver on that. And my job in leading our staff is to make sure they're able to accomplish what's important to their part of the city, while still thinking about the big picture of the community. What do we want this city to be? And that's a challenge.
Right. Now, one thing that did strike me when I was covering City Hall on a more regular basis was, I mean, it's true, you have a lot of churn and you had a lot of inexperienced council members, but it seemed like also, in some ways, that was to your benefit. I mean, it kind of helped you consolidate power in that, like, you were, you were kind of the adult in the room, right? And that there's a lot of power and authority that goes with that. I mean, you could bring counsel into line, could you not?
I didn't look at it that way, Greg,
Mhm.
at all. In fact, it made it more difficult for my executive staff and I to really conduct business, because new people would come in
Mhm.
and they'd want to shift gears. And I remember after one of the first bond programs, new council members came in and they said, well, you can work on that stuff, but here's my list of stuff. I want you to figure out how to fund these major projects.
Mhm.
And and so it was okay if you do that, but that's not
Right.
really what I'm interested in. So it
Mhm.
just made it very difficult. And I think I know there's a part in the book where I say one year there was so much turnover, I think 6 or 7 people, where
Mhm.
they were either leaving to run for another office, or
Mhm.
the kinds of changes and I set up a system with my staff so that we were planning our major policy issues out um, 6 months in advance, so that we wouldn't have everything come due in the same meeting or month, but rather
Mhm.
it was timed, and we were appropriately managing how we talk with the community, the council, and managing. And we had to talk about who's going to be here over the next 6 months, so that we can
Mhm.
properly work with them in their districts on these particular issues. And I
Mhm.
mean, it became very complicated. That's a lot of extra energy that,
Mhm.
if you have longer terms for the council, uh, you don't have to spend all your time and energy on that. So
Right. Right.
to me, it made life much more difficult. Now,
Mhm.
the good thing about professional management is that it provides that continuity.
Mhm.
In strong mayor cities, oftentimes many of the department heads turn over then each time there's a new mayor. But we're there because we have that institutional knowledge. We're carrying out some of those policy directives, and
Mhm.
we can keep things going. But
Right.
I strongly favor having 2 4-year terms as opposed to this 4-2 terms.
Yeah.
And I would think that the community would too, because council members have to go out there and fundraise all the time for these regular elections, just all the time. And
Mhm.
so
Now,
anyway.
you write very warmly, fondly about Mayor Phil Hardberger. I mean, he's the one who ultimately recruited you, brought you to San Antonio. Much less so with the subsequent mayors. That would be Julian Castro, Ivy Taylor, and Ron Nirenberg. So let's start with Julian. Well, kind of the way you introduce him is you you have a sense of urgency about the police and fire contracts and the long-term costs to the city, particularly from their healthcare. And in the book, you say his response is, so you're asking me, and I'm paraphrasing here. If
Yeah, not
I'm too
now,
far
but
off, you can.
later. Yeah, well,
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, I
yeah,
mean, but yeah, it was like you're asking me to you know go against somebody who just helped me. These two unions who just
yeah.
helped get elected mayor.
Although he did say, and I say it in the book, that he'd come back to that. He wanted to do some other things first. And
Mhm.
even when I talked with him, the contracts were due then. They
Right.
were expiring in 2009. So we had started the process while Phil
Mhm.
was still mayor, and then the election. So we're finishing up. So we're in the middle of it. And
Mhm.
he, I wasn't surprised with his response, but I highly regard him for he kept his word with me. We worked together, of
Mhm.
course, on SA 2020, worked on Cafe College.
Mhm.
We did the 2012 bond program,
Mhm.
and pre-K for SA. And after we got through all of those things, then the contract was coming up in 14. And I sat down with him in the spring of 2013 and over that summer and said, I do strongly recommend that we do this. And he was right there. He
Mhm.
said, yes, I agree. We'll take it on. And he was extremely supportive, and of course
So
led the council in appointing the legacy task force.
early on in his first term, when he said, okay, we'll do this later, how did you read that? I mean, that had to have been, I would think, somewhat alarming to you. As
No,
a
I
way of
didn't.
saying,
No, I
no?
wasn't alarmed. And he did say, you can try, but
Mhm.
you're going to, if you do that, you're, and it wasn't just him. I mean, I talked with the whole council as we did on negotiating strategy, but he said, you can try, but I really want to work on some other things first. And I respect him for that. The things that we were able to accomplish are, as I say in the book, no small things.
Right.
Those were big undertakings, and even right now, I'm working on the Pre-K for Essay campaign renewal. I'm on the campaign committee, and we had today, I served on the Early Matters Task Force, co-chaired by Joe Strauss and Peter John Holt. We had I thought it was our final meeting, may not be our final meeting, but our final meeting today with adopting all of our recommendations that will go to the community and our partners and to the mayor and council and the county judge on how we should move forward with early childhood education. So, I mean, these were important things. And I have to say that the Pre-K for Essay is one of my proudest accomplishments. Julian turned it over to me and my team to implement that. He left in, of course, in the summer of 2014, and we stood up that program and hired, and it's been highly effective and well regarded. So I enjoyed working with him, and I thought it was a good working relationship. Phil's was different, and I still, I fondly remember, that first council. They're the ones that brought me here, convinced me to come to San Antonio, and Phil was the right person at the right time. And I think that if you asked Julian, he would say he was better for having followed Phil as mayor, even though he ran against Phil, that he was more successful because we had spent those 4 years getting the house in order. I don't think he could have taken on the projects that he did with the city in the condition that it was. And I don't think he could have been successful with them. But anyway, no, I worked well with him. Ivy and I worked very well together when she was a District 2 council member, and when she was mayor, it was just for a short period of time that she was mayor. And Ron and I worked really well together, and I still talk with him regularly.
Well, and we might be getting a little ahead of ourselves. I'd like you to go back in a moment and just kind of walk through the police and fire contract. But I mean, since you mentioned Ivy Taylor, it was under her that the city came to an agreement with the police union. And you can put this in context for me in a moment, but it seemed from your book, I don't think you explicitly said so, but you got the impression that this was an agreement reached or driven by politics more than anything else. That it wasn't a deal you were in love with, certainly. But the elected officials, it seemed like they were ready to end this conflict, and they essentially cut a deal with the fire or the police union. How did you read that situation? I mean, do you think?
Well, they didn't cut the deal because they aren't negotiating.
Right. But I mean, they are elected officials, so they can.
No, they set the policy and the direction.
Right.
And I have to convince them of what, that here's the strategy and what we should do. I think everyone, perhaps but me, and I probably should have been tired of the conflict. But I thought at the time that we left money on the table, number one, because if we at the time were to give the fire union the same thing we had reached with the police union, we would have been over the 66% of the general fund, which was the council's policy direction, number one. And number two, we didn't get the disciplinary changes that we sought for and were a priority when we began the negotiations in 2014. If you think this mediated settlement, we actually, when the Court of Appeal said no on the Evergreen Clause, and then they had endorsed someone else, for mayor, and their candidate didn't win. We actually asked the courts to order mediation because we wanted to negotiate and they wouldn't come to the table. And so the court did that, and we had a mediator and were able to reach an agreement. I also thought that the 8-year Evergreen Clause was too long. We wanted one less than a year.
And just for context,
those were the three major points that
I
thought we left money on the table. I thought we should have gotten the disciplinary changes, and the 8 years was too long for me. But we take the direction from the policy people, and they thought that once we achieved some progress on the healthcare, that we should go with that and accept the 8 years and deal with the disciplinary issues in a future contract. And so that was their direction, and of course we moved forward with that.
And this was after, and we should go back to the beginning, just for the benefit of people watching, to the beginning of the back and forth between the city and the police and fire unions. But I mean, this mediated settlement with the police union, this came after what, 2 or 3 years of some really acrimonious, effectively campaigning, not a lot of negotiation going on in that time. So so walk us through what was happening in that interim between, that in the 2-year period leading up to that settlement.
Yeah, so in this process, the contracts for both police and fire expired September 30th of 2014, but we started a year ahead of that. Actually, I started a year and a half before that with Mayor Castro to make the business case that we needed to address the financial implications of if this contract were to continue under its current terms, the future projections that it would bankrupt the city. And you'll recall, because you were covering City Hall, that I had actually started that a couple of years before that. I was showing the council the trend lines of public safety spending. And it became especially evident during the Great Recession, because as we actually collected less revenue year over year during the recession and did not raise taxes, we didn't cut public safety, which meant that with less revenue and their costs growing, we had to cut other services. And when they're 2/3 of the general fund budget, that meant reducing recreation hours and library hours and reductions in social services and public health and all of those other things in the budget in the general fund that is only 1/3 of the pie. So it became quite evident that was what was needed. So we made the business case about changing, and how it didn't mean that they would have less healthcare. It meant that we needed to remodel it. It wasn't sustainable the way it was set up back in 1988, 25 years before that. And Mayor Castro appointed the task force that included employee representatives, union reps as well, and the other half of the task force included subject matter experts in pension and healthcare. And it was chaired by former council member Reed Williams. And we studied, Mayor Castro asked me to be on the task force as well, which was fine. I would have attended anyway, since my staff and I were staffing the committee. We looked at a variety of projections. We hired actuaries. We studied, had different people come in and speak on the issues. And the conclusion was that their benefits were excessive by any metric, whether you compare them locally or to other police and fire departments in the state or nationally. And we knew they were excessive, but the unions just dug their heels in and didn't want change. Told us that if we didn't have enough money to raise taxes, to which I replied, easy for them to say, because less than half of our police and fire actually live in San Antonio. The city is prohibited by state law requiring residency. And by the time I left in 2019, only 40% of our firefighters live in San Antonio, and less than half of our police live in San Antonio. And best practices in community policing include police officers living in the neighborhoods they serve. And so I offered as an alternative a housing incentive program for first-time home buyers so that younger officers would buy homes inside San Antonio with a premium on those who bought inside the 410 loop. And we had some takers, but not a lot. So we had the Legacy Task Force. They presented their findings in early 2014. And it was set up that way so that we had a transparent, data-driven community input process that would set the stage for what kinds of changes were needed in the upcoming contracts. I also moved the negotiations, which are required by law to be open to the public downtown, so that they were open to the public and the media could attend, and we invited them, and that hadn't been done before. The unions viewed that as just throwing down the gauntlet, that we were trying to make them look bad, but that wasn't the case. It was really to have a conversation about, here's the way it is, here's what needs to change, here's how we can have a dialogue about what that looks like.
Right.
So that was the process in early 2014.
Right. So then, at what point did in the book you kind of sketch out the legal rationale for the lawsuit the city ultimately filed against the union to eliminate the Evergreen Clause, which was for up to, it was for 10 years. Kind of walk me through how you made that decision, that was the right move to make.
Well, that happened in November of 2014. So by law, fire never came to the table. Right. They refused to negotiate. The police union was on again, off again in the spring. Then Mayor Castro left. He announced he was leaving in late May of 2014. He actually left in July. Council elected Mayor Taylor. We almost reached an agreement with the police officers in August, the night before I presented the fiscal year 2015 budget that was based upon changes in reducing cost in healthcare. On the night before I presented the budget, they withdrew that, but committed to Mayor Taylor that they'd negotiate with us and we'd have a contract by the end of September. We went ahead and adopted the budget based on changes, reduction in cost. We didn't negotiate a settlement by the end of September. Then they said we'd do that by the end of October. I drafted a memo to the mayor and council saying, if this doesn't happen, here are 3 alternatives for you as to what we'll need to cut in the budget. Different ways to approach, because we adopted the budget assuming those expenses were coming down. When we didn't reach an agreement.
How much did you wind up having to cut as a result of that?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was in the millions of dollars. And I presented these alternatives and did it in memo format to the mayor and council and pulled that out in November and said, we want them to negotiate. They're refusing to do so. In fact, at that point, they said, with the holidays coming up, let's just wait till after the first of the year. And I told the council, we'll be at the end of the first quarter of our fiscal year without having made any adjustment. We're going to need to make some adjustments in November. And so the council did. They didn't cut public safety, but that's when they made the decision to hold vacancies, that we weren't going to fill vacancies. And they deferred they took the alternative that was maintaining vacancies and deferring capital construction. They felt that they didn't want to cut any other services in that other 1/3 of the general fund budget. Right. So we did that. And there was a discussion. Our labor attorneys recommended that, or so they thought, that if we filed what's called a declaratory judgment, it's filed in the form of a lawsuit, but a DEC action is, we ask the courts for a declaration on the constitutionality of having a 10-year evergreen clause that commits the city council to funding something for 10 years without any discretion by the council, whether or not they had the funds to do it. Our attorneys had done research on the issue and felt that we had a chance at that. We filed for summary judgment. We advised, and it was in an attempt to get them to come back to the table. We thought if their contract had expired, so for fear of losing in court and not even having any contract, that they would come to the table and negotiate. So it was a way to get them to come to the table. The attorneys had recommended that would get their attention. Instead, they doubled down, and that's when they started running the campaign ads. They were running against me and endorsed someone else for city council and the mayor's race, and it just became very, very vicious and personal in their attack.
Right. So after the city lost at the district court level and at the appellate level, it seemed there was almost a palpable sense, I think, that wow, this has gone on a long time, at least among elected officials and certainly among some voters, I think. Did you ever think that you made a mistake in pursuing this legal strategy, this lawsuit, to the bitter end?
Well, a couple of things. There were moments when I would say, good grief, are we doing the right thing here? But two things I was reminded about. One, if we dropped it, we couldn't refile it. And they hadn't come to the table. So we didn't really have anything to lose. If we lost in the courts, we still had a 10-year evergreen clause. So why drop it at that point? We also knew, and not just me, our attorneys had discussed with the council, because of relationships locally in the community, we would probably lose in the district court and the circuit, in the Court of Appeals. I'm sorry, not the circuit, the Court of Appeals. And but we'd have our best chance at the Supreme Court. Now, the unions, two things happened. They portrayed this as suing the police officers who put their lives on the line. That's not what was happening. We were asking the courts for a constitutional question, a constitutional answer on whether or not this was the right thing, that there were, a 10-year evergreen clause. There are attorneys out there who and the Supreme Court didn't decide the issue. Of course, the unions portrayed it as, oh, you lost at the Supreme Court. We didn't lose at the Supreme Court. They chose not to take the case. Of all the cases submitted to them, they take very few of them, I'm told less than 10%. And of course, we hired Wallace Jefferson, the retired Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, to represent us in the process. So we thought that they would take the case. They decided not to on summary judgment. There are several attorneys in San Antonio who called me at the time and said, if you present and file this as a full case, you'll have a chance to win, where there's a full presentation and trial. We exchanged 2 sets of briefs on the issue for them to consider it on summary judgment, and they declined to take the case. But everyone had grown tired of that conflict, and it was so misunderstood that we settled on the 8-year, reducing the 10-year evergreen clause to 8 years. To me, it makes very little difference whether it's 8 or 10 years. It needs to be less than a year.
Interesting. Now, there's also a really kind of fascinating passage in your book about the 3 propositions that the fire union got on the ballot in 2018. One that would have allowed or made it a lot easier for petitioners to essentially change ordinances through the ballot box, to have even taken on capital spending that they didn't particularly like if they collected enough signatures. The other was to cap the city manager's tenure at 8 years, and to also cap her salary. Of course, it didn't affect you. And also for the fire union to say, hey, we're at a stalemate, we're going to mediation.
No. Our binding,
finding her.
at their sole
Right.
discretion. City
Right.
would have no say. They had,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Now, as this was happening, and I couldn't tell in the book if it was already on the ballot or if it was on the way. You actually volunteered to resign if the mayor thought that would be helpful, that it would help chances that these would be defeated at the ballot box. Explain to me what your reasoning was. Why did you think resigning might help defeat
Well, I took this on in the best interest of the city. I mean, I dedicate the book to the residents of the community and the public safety personnel that keep us safe. Everything that we did was about how do we improve the financial position of the city and make this sustainable, because we're a growing community, one of the fastest growing in the nation. Public safety is a core business. Perhaps that will be changing. I know the city is now hosting these community conversations about what needs to change and how we go about policing, but public safety is important to the community. And so we took this on to protect the residents of the community. And so I said, you know, I had been talking about retiring for several years. When I took on this challenge and I sat down with my staff and the mayor and council and said, let's do this, in my mind, I was thinking it'd be very difficult, but it could take a couple of years, but then I would retire. That would be my final legacy in terms of my tenure as manager, and I would go on. Well, that was 5 years ago. You know, I didn't know it was going to take 6 years. I didn't want to leave in the middle of the process and just say, throw up my hands and say, oh, you know, I'm not dealing with this anymore. But if they put that on the ballot, and it's very hard. I can't think of a salary of an executive in San Antonio, public or private, that if put on the ballot, people would vote for, really. So I knew that chances weren't great. And even though it didn't affect me, I wanted what was in the best interest of the city. So I said, do I help the process? And I was basically told at the time, that's just giving in to them. No, don't do that. And even when I talked about after it happened, I decided to go ahead and retire because I knew my work was done. I talk about that in the epilogue in the book. They'd either elect their candidate to try to get what they wanted, or they'd go to binding arbitration. So my work at that point, in terms of what I could influence in the process, was done. And I didn't think it was healthy for the city to have the mayor and council running for election in the spring and then being asked by voters, hey, I thought we capped her salary. Why is she still being paid? And just having to explain that over and over again. Not good. That wasn't healthy for the city.
Well, did you also feel like if you resigned ahead of that vote on the 3 proposals, you would be out of the mix, and you know, after a number of years of having the unions campaign against you, you know, you were approaching your 14th year as city manager, like inevitably, you know, the public regard for you could suffer a little bit. There might be a little Sheryl Sculley exhaustion. Was that part of your thinking, that, you know, that you personally could be a detriment to this vote?
I don't, not a detriment as much as I thought that it might be helpful to defeating those 3 propositions, possibly, if I were out of the mix. You know, I talk a little bit in the book about, I wasn't looking at all the TV ads and reading all the social media. I mean, they were really working hard and spending a lot of money to demonize me. And if you say repeatedly, she's the devil, she's the devil, she's the devil, and then people say, wow, maybe she's the devil. You know, it's that, and it went on for years. You know, there were people who called me in the beginning of the process when they first started running the TV ads and said, gosh, we need to run our own ads. And I said, please don't. That's good money after bad. Let's just stay focused. Let's get accomplished what we need to do. But I had no idea it was going to go on for that many years. And so I thought it could be helpful, but I was asked not to resign. So there we are. And it didn't affect me, but ironically, it's two things. One, it's the salary I was offered back in 2005.
Yeah, I thought that was funny. Yeah,
and then secondly, you may recall the council had commissioned an outside compensation consultant to study the city manager's salary. And they came back in March of 2019 with a report that said, yes, it's in the range that it should be. And, people said, well, gosh, you're the highest paid in the country. Well, I'm not going to apologize for my salary. I did spend the last 30 years working in the two largest council manager form of government cities in the country, and had more than 40 years of experience in city management. So I was one of the senior city managers in the country. So no apologies. And some of my staff who have gone on to be city managers in other cities, of course, T.C. Broadnax, who was one of the assistant city managers that I recruited to San Antonio early in my tenure, worked in San Antonio for 5 years, then became city manager of Tacoma, Washington, but then was recruited to Dallas, Texas, and is now serving as manager there, is earning more than Eric is in compensation. And Peter Zanoni, another one of my deputies, when he wasn't selected city manager here, was offered the position in Corpus Christi. He's there. You may remember Penny Postoke Ferguson. I recruited her to San Antonio from Kansas early in my tenure. She's now the county manager of Johnson County, Kansas. So these are excellent people, and the limitation eventually will be a problem for the city. Eric is from here. He's done an excellent job, but he's right at that, the council moved him up right to that top salary, and whether or not he'll stay in San Antonio for 8 years at the same salary will be a decision he'll have to make as to whether or not he'll do that.
Right. Now, in your 13, 14 years as city manager, kind of intermittently, your salary and your total compensation, including bonuses, would be an issue, and it would just kind of pop up whenever your contract was under review by council. Each time it got approved, but it was kind of a hubbub at the time. What did you make of that? I mean, did you ever did you ever say to yourself, if I were a man, this might not be such a big issue? Like, did you ever see sexism playing into?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no question. I think so. And the unions would not have treated a man from San Antonio the way they treated me. I'm convinced of that. There was quite a bit of sexism involved in this. But San Antonio is a poor community. There are a lot of inequities. And so it's hard for people who are earning low wages to even be able to relate to an executive's salary. But the municipal corporation of the city of San Antonio is a big business. I mean, it's a highly diversified corporation, 40 different city departments, 13,000 employees, nearly $3 billion annual budget, and managing in a very diverse power structure, with a board of directors that changes regularly. I was recruited since I retired to a corporate board, and they look for tenure. There are people on the boards on the board I'm serving on that have served for 10 years, 20 years, but at the same time, they have, some planning as to bringing in new people. But they want the continuity so that they become very familiar with the corporation and can offer strong, solid advice and not be on a constant learning curve. So I think that, the salary issue is a tough one. Now, you'll recall, because you covered City Hall when I was first recruited, that there was no bonus. Actually, characterizing it as a bonus happened during Mayor Taylor's tenure. Phil Hardberger and Julian Castro it was a retainage clause that they would pay me at the end of the contract period to keep me. So they were worried I was going to leave, and it was a retainage amount. When Ivy became mayor, she decided that she wanted to convert that into a bonus structure. And I was fine with that based on performance metrics. Okay, that worked for me, but then it became contentious and political.
Right.
I noticed, well, okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No,
you were about to say something interesting. I know it. Go ahead. Say it.
I'll hold that thought. You have another question?
No, you don't get how this works. No, don't. No, you just wrote a book.
Yeah.
Cope with it.
Right now, but I don't think people fully understand the breadth of responsibility for the city manager. I mean, the city manager hires and fires all the employees, and so it's running not just the day-to-day operation, but managing the 13,000 employees. And I spent a tremendous amount of time evaluating talent and recruiting from outside the organization, as well as developing staff and promoting from within. Eric Walsh was in a much lower level position. I promoted him 3 times. I promoted Maria Villagomez 3 times, promoted Lori Houston, recruited Carlos Contreras, promoted Rod Sanchez, Ben Gorzel. So it hired and recruited both Charles Hood, our fire chief, and Bill McManus, the police chief, as well as numerous other department heads. David McCary was one of my early hires over solid waste as we implemented automation and increasing our recycling programs in the community. So it's a very complicated job. The budget is complicated, as well as the policy issues. And you do that in an environment all in the public, so that everyone knows and is watching your every step and hoping to report a stumble,
Right.
So
you've been really giving of your time. I think we're twice as much time as we had agreed on initially, and I thank you for that. I want to make one more observation about your book, because I thought it was hilarious. You blew off Red McCombs when he called to recruit you. I thought that was hilarious. Didn't even know who the guy was. That was fantastic.
Well, I'll let the readers read that story for themselves. My daughter, who was a Texas Longhorn, was quite disappointed that I didn't remember touring the McCombs College of Business when we looked at colleges.
Yeah, and just for those watching, McCombs called at some point in your recruitment to try to convince you to come to San Antonio. And of course, you had no idea who he was, and you effectively blew him off. So probably didn't happen.
Respectively, but I was a little nervous when I finally met him.
Right.
But he was very gracious about it, and we became friends in the process. We didn't always agree, but he would call me regularly to offer his opinion, and I would let him know what and why I was doing what I was doing, and we had a respectful professional relationship.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome. Thanks, Greg.
Hey, good luck. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye-bye.